Welcome to Greek for a Week. I'm glad that you are viewing another week's video here. You'll see, according to the title slide here, that we are looking at a diagram of chapter 4, verses 12 through 19 of the book of 1 Peter. In the last couple of weeks, not only have we been looking through this paragraph, but we've kind of been looking at the category of thoughts about suffering. I've tried to capture Peter's intent through this paragraph. For sure, it is a paragraph that does lead to discussions regarding suffering, but then also I think it's an opportunity for Peter to move his argument forward and how he can begin to console them and admonish them in light of the suffering that's inevitable. So as we move forward here and look at the text, you'll see that we have a vocative here in verse 12. So I would suggest the agape toi, beloved or beloved ones. I'm going to suggest that moves us forward to the last section of Peter's letter. So that's kind of a discourse marker or a break in the paragraph or a break in the thought. You also notice here several conditional clauses here in verse 14, verse 16, and then you'll see it again in verse 18. Yes, and also here we have one in verse 17. So these conditional clauses kind of provide for us some scenarios that I think Peter is walking the reader through to help us understand how we might view his admonitions towards suffering. So as we move forward, we can see that beloved is our marker. That's our paragraph marker for verse 12. He begins with an imperative, do not be surprised. Do not be surprised. Why? I'm taking that dative there, a dative of cause, because of the fiery ordeal among you. And then how that fiery ordeal can be further describe is it takes place upon you. So there's our attributive participle. And of course, it has a purpose, and that purpose is to test the readers. And I moved this part of the verse out to the side here because he's really saying, do not be surprised as something strange is happening to you. And the reason why he doesn't want them to be surprised is, I would suggest, the inevitability of the testing and the fiery ordeal that will come your direction. So then we move on to verse 13. But what should I do in contrast to the do not be surprised? But I should keep on rejoicing. And I've put the translation keep on rejoicing because the imperative here is a present imperative, and I wanted that continuation to come out in the translation. The purpose for you to keep on rejoicing is in order that, or so that, at the revelation of his glory, so there's the temporal clause, at the revelation of his glory, you may be glad. And how might you be glad? You also will continue to rejoice. The manner in which you will be glad is by rejoicing. Then here's one of those conditional statements. If you are mocked or if you are reviled for the name of Christ, then you are a blessed one. Because why? The Spirit of glory and the Spirit of God rests upon you. So I take those two together here. And that is, you could say, God resting upon you even through the difficulty. Verse 15, however, or again, you could use but here. The gar kind of serves as a way to, it's a caveat, if you will, to what precedes here. But, or however, let none of you suffer. So the inevitability of the suffering here, as well as even here, comes down to a contrast in verse 15. But let's not suffer. And then what's the role in which he doesn't want us to suffer? As a murderer or a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody. So these are examples of what role to not be the reason you are suffering. Rather, he wants it to be, obviously, if God wills it. So let's look at verse 16. So now we have a de here that signals a change in suffering for the corrupt behavior. That was verse 15, to now suffering as a Christian in verse 16. Again, another conditional clause. If anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be disgraced or put to shame. So here's another de. So this isn't a strong contrast, but it is changing the situation. Don't be disgraced or put to shame, but instead, he says, let him glorify God in his name. Why? Because it is time to begin judgment from the house of God. And if it first begins with us, in other words, if the suffering that God should see fit to bring our direction, if that first begins with us, then really what is the end of those who disobey? So here's our substantival participle, those who disobey the gospel of God. Verse 18, if it is with difficulty, okay, so we have a conditional clause here, another one here. If it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, then what will become of the godless man and the sinner? So these two scenarios here, verse 17 and verse 18, Peter's basically saying that the situation for those who are not obeying the gospel of God, who are not godly, and who are not saved, in a sense, he is saying the situation for them, or the judgment for them, is much worse. Again, that's the consolation, the admonition that even though you're suffering, you can glorify God. So then, you could say, what's the result of this paragraph? Those who also suffer. Here's our substantival participle, those who also suffer. The basis being the will of God. What is he encouraging them to do? Let them entrust their souls to the faithful Creator in doing, here's the key, in doing what is right as opposed to what is wrong. And that goes back to verse 15. So finally, let me show you what might work as a preaching outline or a sermon outline. What to do when I suffer. I should, expect suffering. So suffering is to be expected. Rejoice. Again, keep on rejoicing despite the suffering, Don't do what verse 15 says here when he talks about an evildoer, talks about the one who is not godly, but he is asking us to live righteously, glorify God. Why should we glorify God? Because judgment is upon us, and of course that is not eschatological judgment. That is not his point here. Therefore, to those who suffer, verse 19, trust God. So these opportunities for the readers to, again, you could say rejoice. You could even say here, rejoice in God, glorify God, and trust God. So when I suffer, those are opportunities for us to be God focused. Trust this has been helpful. Chapter 4, verses 12 through 19. We will begin chapter 5 next week. Have a great week.